Welcome, everybody. This video is the first of a series of videos on the book, The Third Pillar. So the third pillar, How Markets and the State Leave the Community Behind, is a book by Dr. Raghuram Rajan, published by Penguin Random House. I really like this book. I think it's a fantastic book. It does a good job of highlighting how kind of current public policy thought, as well as let's say the last 100 years of political economy or thought on political economy, really highlights the markets and the state. But by doing that, we end up leaving behind the community. So that is, we leave it behind both in our thought and how these institutions, the market and the state, functionally leave it behind, especially when we don't think about the community in our public policy discussions and public policy design. So the book does a great job of highlighting the importance of the community and how these three pillars of a healthy society might help to balance each other and provide different goods. The book has a preface, introduction, and then three main parts. The goal of this video is to provide an introduction and a commentary on part one of the book. So for Policy 510 students, the preface, introduction, parts two and three are required readings. Part one is not. And so this video series will be a substitute for part one for Policy 510 students. Okay, so the book talks about three pillars of a healthy society: the state, the market, and the community. Now, as I mentioned, kind of political economy thought often focuses on the relative influence of the state and the market. So you might recognize that on, let's say, the farther left side of the political spectrum really emphasizes the importance and the role of the state. Whereas on the right side of the political spectrum, there's a much stronger emphasis on the market. Now, this kind of framing of political economy, which I'm sure many of us are quite familiar with, really leaves out this third pillar that Dr. Rajan is highlighting called the community. And the big thrust of the book is to point out how important the community is and how really these three pillars feed off on each other. They support but also constrain and hinder each other, and that having them in a good balance will really be the best way to promote a healthy society. So, just kind of as an introduction to kind of lay the foundation for this, we could argue that the three pillars provide particular goods to society. And by that I mean each pillar has a certain set of goods that society can draw from it or what it provides to society. When we recognize the goods that these different pillars provide to society, we can begin to notice or recognize how a careful balance between the three pillars becomes important in terms of promoting the common good. So, for example, the state, which Dr. Rajan kind of localizes the concept of the state at kind of the national or government level, could even potentially include the international level, or perhaps regional governments we could call the state. What the state does, or the good or the goods that it provides, is that the state provides security. So we can think about this as maybe the federal government level. The federal government provides national security. It has the opportunity to provide kind of a unifying order for society that it can kind of guide in a unified way, that national society. It can intervene in markets to help solve market failures. I won't go into tremendous detail on the specifics of market failures in these videos, but you'll certainly encounter it in microeconomics. The state can resolve disputes or promote justice within a society. It protects private property. It can also provide public goods. Okay, so public goods, these are goods like, let's say, transportation infrastructure that the market or the community are ill-equipped to provide. Okay, so the state offers certain goods to society. The market also provides certain goods. So, for example, the market really a competitive economic market, and that's really what Dr. Rajan means, is a competitive, free economic market, um, efficiently produces goods and services. So the market really is the institution or the pillar of society that brings efficiency or productive efficiency to that society. It ensures that resources are deployed and distributed efficiently. And because of that efficiency, it raises the standard of living, at least on average. Okay, and finally, the community, this third pillar that Dr. Rajan is pointing out, the one that is often forgotten in kind of intellectual thought on public policy or political economy, as well as the institution that's often forgot about or missed when making public policy. Okay, the community provides essential goods to society as well. The community is really the institution that provides a sense of deep belonging and purpose. It provides for the needs of its members through non-market means, particularly relational or customary means. It can help solve market failures, just like the state can. It generates and nurtures human life. It inculcates virtue, and it can also provide public goods. And so the community is an important aspect of a healthy society that provides goods um, to society. Now, um, kind of the big thrust of the third pillar is kind of recognizing that these pillars can be out of balance, and this can result in kind of negative social outcomes, right? Because each pillar provides certain goods. If a pillar is too weak, then society lacks the goods of that pillar. So, for example, if the market is weak, let's say it's weak because there's excessive restraint by the government, or because of market failures, or because the markets are poorly integrated. That is, they're excessively localized, or property rights are not protected. If the market is too weak, society will suffer from inefficiency. Likewise, if the state is too weak, the society might rely too much on markets, and markets can fail, which of course you'll learn more about in microeconomics. Also, the state, if it's too weak, can fail to produce, the goods provided by the state. There's some degree of insecurity, right? It can fail to provide kind of a unifying framework in which the market or the community can operate. And so when the state is weak, the members of that society might face insecurity. But lastly, and this is really important to recognize in the current kind of political debate, is that if the community is weak, when I say community being weak, that means if a community is dysfunctional or insular, or if the community fails in kind of providing its own goods, which we'll talk about how that can happen, or excessive or disordered state or market crowd out the community. So if the community is weak because of these things, that can result in individuals or families being isolated. It can also result in kind of a collusion between the state and the market, that results in really taking advantage of the individual members or the different institutions within a society. Okay, so when these pillars are out of balance, there's always going to be some negative social problem that emerges from this lack of balance. And this, I think, is the key takeaway from this book. Okay, so we want to avoid the negative consequences of this imbalance between the three pillars. Now, in part one of the book, Dr. Rajan kind of tells a narrative over the course of several chapters, kind of tells a narrative from the high Middle Ages up to kind of the middle of the 20th century. And the goal of that narrative is to kind of sketch out across time how the different pillars, these pillars, evolved over that time, and kind of how they emerge up to the mid 20th century, which is when the book really kind of picks up in part two to explain the imbalance between the pillars that we experience today. What I hope to do in kind of this commentary on part one is I want to provide a very stylized history, a very stylized exploration of that time period from, let's say, the High Middle Ages up to the middle of the 20th century, very stylized. Um, that will be more simple in many ways from Dr. Rajan's presentation in part one, but I also want to kind of take that as an opportunity to highlight, um, hopefully with great clarity, how these pillars interact with each other. In this particular lecture, I'm going to kind of lay the foundation by talking about, in a very stylized way, the society of the High Middle Ages and how the different pillars balance each other, or we could say are imbalanced at that time, to lay the foundation for charting the evolution of the pillars across the time period that I mentioned. All right, so let's jump in there. So Dr. Rajan starts in the High Middle Ages and kind of talks about the medieval manor. So this would be, we might use different terms. We could use the term fiefdom or kind of the land ruled by the nobility or the aristocracy, we could say. Now, he uses the medieval manor, and I'll try to use that term. He uses the medieval manor as kind of an illustration of this third pillar, the community. Okay. And the medieval manor really embodies, quote, the community in a very particular and pretty clear way. I think starting at this time in history is actually quite helpful because it's fairly simple to illustrate what this means when we talk about the community. So the medieval manor, this would have been kind of a social structure. And almost the entirety of medieval Europe, almost the entirety of the population of medieval Europe would have lived in a or on a medieval manor. So these manors are kind of close-knit communities, populated primarily by peasants. So we have some orange houses here, right? These would be peasants' homes, and the peasants would have access to property, access to land that they would cultivate. They would also, all right, so that's what we have here. They have access to land that they can cultivate, access to water. They would all have access. They would also have access to forested land where they could hunt, where they could gather firewood, and access to pasture where they could pasture animals. This area here they would kind of call the commons. This is land that isn't owned by anyone in the community, but use of the commons is kind of regulated by traditional custom, and all the members of this community would be able to use it. Now, the medieval manor is a very close-knit community of people. In fact, for the peasant farmer living on a medieval manor, they might never leave the manor. They might live their entire life within just a couple mile radius of that medieval manor. And so they live in very close-knit, tight-knit communities, and very, in many ways, kind of sustainable communities across time. Now, the peasant living in these communities, we certainly would consider quite poor economically, but the close-knit community in which the peasants on the manor live, um, would provide a social safety net that really kind of meets at least the immediate needs of the members of the community. Okay. Now, these medieval manors were, we could say, ruled over by some sort of nobility, some sort of aristocrat or aristocracy. So maybe we could call the noble lord or a duke. Okay. And there was a relationship between the aristocrat and the peasants that lived in the manor. So the peasants that lived kind of under the rule of the noble would make customary payments of some of their produce to, let's say, the Duke. Okay. Now, we could call this rent, but it's not rent in the way that we would understand it today, because the terms of it were really kind of dictated by custom and were responsive to the needs of the peasants at the time. That is, the Duke might not expect a payment to be made in a year in which there's a drought, for example. These rents tend to be fairly low, right? So they created a context in which the peasants had a fairly consistent and reliable access to their land. Um, and paid kind of low rent for that land. Okay. And in return for these customary payments, the noble or the duke would provide protections. They would preserve customary property rights and maintain peace within the manor. And when I say preserve customary property rights, it's important to recognize that in the medieval manner, land was not transferable through sale. So one peasant wouldn't buy land from another, but rather land was tied to families and it would get passed down from family member to family member to family member. Okay, so access to land was really dictated by customary property rights rather than kind of legal or formal property rights as we might experience or think of today. Okay, so this medieval manor really falls into this classification of community. It is not a market economy. Exchanges between people occur between people that are in relationship with each other. That is, if there's a transfer of goods between individuals, those individuals know each other. They're in relationship with each other, right? So exchanges are relationally close. They take place within close relationships. Transactions are primarily non-monetary. So people are not buying and selling for money. They're primarily trading, bartering with other members of their community. There's some money, but it's primarily non-monetary. For example, the peasants would not pay the landlord money for rent. Instead, they would provide a customary amount of their produce in exchange, right, for the protection that the duke or the lord provided. Property rights were enforced through custom and relationship, as I mentioned before. So these markets were not competitive and they were not at all what we would call efficient. All right, so these feudal manors are not market economies and therefore they are not efficient. But they're stable and they're characterized by loyal relationships. They're characterized by relationships between peasants within the community, and they're characterized by relationship between the aristocrat, the duke, and the peasants. And in this social structure that's characterized by relationship and custom rather than contract and law, the powerful, that is the aristocracy, had a cultural or religious, a customary obligation to the peasant. They had to look out for the well-being of the peasant. So even though there was, in a certain sense, inequality or asymmetry, right? The duke certainly had more power or more wealth, you could say, than the peasant. They also had a customary or traditional religious obligation to the peasant class, and therefore, what we could call rent or the customary rent was typically relatively small because the duke or the aristocrat was really looking out for, to some extent, the well-being of the peasants under their care. Okay, now I'd like to kind of make a note of this. I made this point just a moment ago that these feudal economies, this manor economy, or we could call the community, is not efficient. This is really important to recognize because I think what we will see as we move forward is that the community is characterized by exchanges and relationships and customs that do not generate an economically efficient distribution of resources. And when I say it's not efficient or not economically efficient, I don't mean anything derogatory by that. I mean it as a purely technical term. It is not technically efficient. That's not to say that it's bad. I wouldn't say that at all. Just say it's not technically efficient. Now, I want to elaborate on that. And I think this kind of medieval manner kind of gives us a really nice context in which to give kind of a simple but illustrative example of what we mean by economically efficient. Okay, so we can say that this customary community of the medieval manor is not economically efficient. Why? What do I mean by that? What is this efficiency? All right, so let me illustrate this. So imagine in the manor, right? So in the manor, you have a village, you have families living in community with each other. in a village context. So we have lots of different farmers who cultivate different pieces of land. Now let's just imagine that we have farmer one and farmer two. We have different farmers. And for whatever reason, farmer two is more productive than farmer one. So when I say more productive, I mean farmer one, given the same amount of land, can produce more crops. Now, why? What makes them more productive? I don't know. Maybe they work harder. Maybe they have more insight. They're more attentive to detail on their farm. I don't exactly, they just have a green thumb. There's something more productive about farmer two than farmer one. Okay, now in a market economy, a free market economy where there's buying and selling of goods and services facilitated by monetary transactions, um, free market transactions of goods and services. So in a market economy, farmer two could sell their crops, right? So farmer two is more productive. They could produce more crops and sell those crops and sell those crops for money. Then they could use that money and they could go to farmer one and say, hey, you know what? I'd like to buy your land. And because farmer two has more money than farmer one, right? They have more money because they're more productive. They can go and they can make an offer to farmer one to buy their land. Just the fact that farmer two is more productive than farmer one will naturally equip farmer two with the resources necessary to acquire the assets of farmer one. That is, eventually farmer two, because they're more productive, will accumulate enough money to allow them to make an offer to buy the land of farmer one. And once farmer two can offer enough money to farmer one might sell. And if farmer one sells their land to farmer two, then farmer two will begin cultivating that land and produce more. And so what you can see here is that when goods and services can be exchanged freely and for money, that farmer two will have the ability to acquire more land. That is, markets allow resources to move from less productive hands to more productive hands. This is one thing that markets do, and it's something that markets do naturally. A free market allows farmer two, who is more productive, to acquire the ability to gain the resources. When I say the resources, I mean like to acquire the monetary assets that would allow them to buy, in this case, land, or you could just speak more broadly, to buy the resources owned by less productive people. And so what markets do is markets move resources from less productive hands to more productive hands. And the result of that, as you can see from this illustration, when the green squiggly lines, the result of that is that more will be produced because resources are being transferred into the hands of those that are more productive. And so more is produced. All right, so the market generates efficiency. This is what we call by efficiency, productive efficiency. More is being produced with the same amount of inputs. In this case, we have the same amount of land, but more is produced, as represented by the thick squiggly lines, the thick green squiggly lines. But the community is not efficient because it doesn't work this way. In the community, you don't buy land. Access to land is transmitted through custom, through tradition, through family. Families, whether they're productive or not productive, or I should say, whether they're less productive or more productive, families have secure access to their land. They can cultivate their land and they can pass their land on to their children. So the less productive farmers will maintain access to their land across time. Farmer two cannot buy the land of farmer one. Now, of course, because of that, the land owned by farmer one will not produce as much. And the resources, in this case, land, is not going to move from the hands of the less productive to the more productive. And so we are not going to produce as much as possible given the amount of land we have. This is what we mean by inefficient. Moreover, in the medieval manor economy, there was fairly limited opportunity to sell excess crops. It wasn't completely absent, but there's less opportunity to sell. Trading was less common at the time. And so farmer two, even though they're, let's say, inclined to be more productive, without the opportunity to sell for money and to use that money to buy more land, farmer two doesn't even really have any incentive to be as productive as they could be. And so what happens is that farmer two, even though they're a little bit more productive, they don't produce to their full capacity. And so what we have in this kind of community, traditional, non-market economic context, a lot less is produced than what is possible given the same amount of land because the incentives just aren't there. This is what we mean by efficiency. This is what I mean by efficiency in this kind of traditional kind of medieval manor context. But I think this illustration is also helpful to understand what free markets do for resources throughout all of history, including today. Free markets allow resources of that economy to move from less efficient hands to more efficient hands. And as a result, we produce more with the same amount of inputs. When we don't have free markets, we have this kind of productive inefficiency. We don't produce as much as we could. Now, when I say that, again, I don't mean that in a derogatory way. The medieval society has a lot of goods associated with it that we'll talk about in a minute. For example, stable and loyal relationships that have a lot of value that we might want to maintain, even though, let's say, for example, they're not economically efficient. So I don't mean anything derogatory by saying that the community is not efficient. I just mean it in a purely technical manner. Okay, so in medieval society, these medieval manors oftentimes were ruled over by the aristocracy, but they might also be ruled over by monasteries or institutions of the church. Similar structure. With the church, where the peasants would provide customary rent to the monastery, and the monastery would provide a certain kind of security for that land, not through strength of arms like the nobility would, but by kind of the certain social protection that monasteries or other institutions of the church enjoyed. Okay. Also, part of this medieval societies, you had the towns. Towns were also an example of the community in this context. You could say the town is a little bit closer to what we might call a market economy, because in a medieval town, transactions were more likely to take place between strangers, and there was greater use of money. So the towns are a little bit more like market economies, more like it in the sense that there's transactions between strangers and greater use of money instead of barter, but still not quite. The medieval town still existed within a network of strong relationships, and production within towns were typically dominated by guilds. Guilds are an example of an economic community, a collection of producers who collude on wages, how much to pay their workers, prices, how much to sell their goods, and productive techniques. These medieval guilds were true communities. They were collections of individuals who shared life with each other. They shared social life. They would host festivals. There was real human community at the local town level between guilds. So when we talk about guilds, we might say like all of the bakers in a town were part of a bakers guild, or all of the blacksmiths in a town were part of a guild, blacksmith guild. Okay. And so the medieval market, so if I say that the medieval manor and the medieval town are examples of the community that existed in kind of the High Middle Ages, the market in the High Middle Ages would be represented by the network of transactions and trade that takes place between the manors and the towns. All right, also transactions and trade between towns and different kingdoms. Now, the market The true kind of free market will have certain characteristics. One is it's characterized by voluntary exchanges, unrestricted um, by kind of like, let's say, imposition by the state or imposition by other sources. So transactions are purely based on voluntary exchanges. They're also characterized by arm's length transactions. When I say that, I mean transactions between strangers who may or may not have repeated interactions, and the use of money and credit to facilitate those transactions. Now, in the High Middle Ages, and certainly before that, the market was very weak. This market pillar was very weak. It was limited in frequency and scope. There was a lot less trade than what we would experience today. Trade networks were relatively small. Towns were relatively small. Most people lived on medieval manors and were nearly subsistence. That means they produced what they needed for their own consumption, and there was a relatively low amount of trade between towns, between the manors, and between kingdoms. Okay, so kind of recapping, in this High Middle Ages context, the community was represented by the manor, or also the medieval town to some extent. The market is represented by these kind of trade networks between the different communities. And then finally, the state is represented by the king or the queen. All right. Now, in this context, the medieval kingdom, the king or the queen represents a relatively wealthy noble to whom all the other nobles kind of within that realm, within that country, kind of pledge a certain amount of allegiance to. But the state, in this context, is relatively weak. All right, has a very limited military. It doesn't even necessarily have a military that's much larger than any of the individual dukes or aristocrats. It owns its own land and generates revenue from the ownership of its own land. It also can raise taxes from the other lords, the other nobles, or the aristocracy, but has very limited ability to kind of enforce that tax collection. The state has very limited bureaucracy. And and like I mentioned, it has no monopoly on force. It doesn't necessarily even have a larger military capacity than the other nobles in the kingdom. So it really requires the loyalty and the cooperation of those nobles in order to wage war, to defend the kingdom, or raise taxes, etc. Okay, so in this context, so we can see this medieval kingdom. The medieval kingdom is really characterized by a particular kind of distribution of power across the pillars. This medieval kingdom has a state. That state is very weak. It also has a market, which is also very weak. And it has the community pillar. The community is very strong. In fact, the community really is what dominates medieval society. Almost everyone um, lives on medieval manors. They they procure the resources by which they live. Their livelihoods come primarily from the community pillar. They don't derive a lot of their livelihood from the state, very, very, very little, and they don't derive most of their livelihood from the market, very little. Most of people's livelihoods, most of what they rely upon, what they exist and what they experience in their life comes from the community pillar. And so the community pillar is very strong. The community pillar has the capacity to constrain the other pillars. So, for example, um, the guilds in the medieval towns, they are able to constrain voluntary transactions. They can constrain the market. The medieval guild sets prices and wages. So prices and wages are not determined by the free market or by voluntary exchanges. Instead, they are determined by the community power of the guild. An important institution of the community in the medieval context is the church. I should say in the medieval context, but certainly also in the contemporary or present context. To say church, we could also just speak about religion more broadly, plays a very important role within this broader kind of community context. And the church had the ability to constrain the state and to constrain the market. The church or religion kind of provides a unifying moral framework that helped to dictate what the state, the king, the monarch could do or not do. The moral framework could provide a constraint or a framework that could dictate what could be done in the market, provided a moral framework for what constituted morally legitimate market engagement or market transactions and morally illegitimate market transactions. And so these institutions, the institution of the community, constrains the state and the market. And in the High Middle Ages, the community was very strong. Now, maybe just a little bit of a note on religion, in this context, the church, to just kind of round out this first lecture. The church, we can kind of see it, and certainly Dr. Rajan frames it in this way, to see the church as an institution that kind of operates within the realm of community. Okay, when I say it operates within the realm of community, the church is not a state. It doesn't have like a military capacity to kind of enforce. It's the church does not operate like a state. It's also not the market. It doesn't operate through the same logic as the market. So it doesn't operate through the same logic, the same mechanisms as the state or the market. So it really operates within the realm of community. The church provided a unifying framework that provided a sense of unity within countries or within kingdoms, but also that transcended kingdoms in medieval Europe. And finally, church institutions provided social services and a moral framework that guided behavior, including economic behavior. In the book, Dr. Rajan explains how the church provided kind of moral rules regarding the charging of interest on loans. Really, it banned the charging of interest, what is called usury, during the High Middle Ages as a way of protecting the poor from exploitation by the rich in this kind of community context. So this kind of is a particular example of how the church kind of provided constraint on economic behavior, on certain economic action. Okay, so the church then and now provides an important role within society that kind of operates within the realm of community. All right. Okay, so we'll pick up in the next lecture, in which I will talk about how the pillars evolved over time from this kind of starting point with medieval Europe. Thank you.